The child's voice came from nowhere. Thomas Garrett had been awake for reasons he couldn't name. Something in the air, maybe, or the way the horses had gone quiet an hour before midnight. He sat at the kitchen table with his hands around a cold cup of coffee, listening to the house settle, when he heard it, small, trembling, just outside the back door. "They're coming back for me." He didn't move at first. The words hung in the dark like smoke, and for a moment he wondered if he'd imagined them. But then he heard breathing, shallow, fast, the kind that comes after running. Thomas rose slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. He reached for the rifle leaning against the doorframe, fingers closing around worn wood that had seen more use than he cared to remember. He moved to the window and pulled the curtain back just enough to see. A boy stood in the yard, maybe 8 years old, maybe younger. It was hard to tell in the moonlight. He was barefoot, wearing a torn shirt that hung past his knees, and his face was streaked with dirt and something darker. Blood, maybe. His eyes were wide, fixed on the barn as if something might emerge from it at any second. Thomas opened the door. The boy spun around, stumbled backward, nearly fell. His hands came up instinctively, palms out, and Thomas saw the rope burns around his wrists, raw, recent, still weeping. "Easy," Thomas said, lowering the rifle slightly. "You're all right." The boy didn't look like he believed that. Thomas stepped onto the porch, boots heavy on the wood. The night was still, too still. No coyotes, no wind, just the distant creak of the barn door swinging on its hinge. He scanned the horizon, nothing but dark hills and darker sky. "Who's coming back?" Thomas asked. The boy's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He was shaken now, whole body trembling like a leaf in a storm that hadn't arrived yet. Thomas crouched down, set the rifle across his knees. "You hurt?" The boy shook his head, then nodded, then seemed to forget the question entirely. His eyes drifted back toward the road, the one that cut through the valley and disappeared into the trees 3 miles north. "When?" Thomas asked. "Tonight," the boy whispered. "Before sunrise. They said," his voice cracked, "they said they'd finish it." Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd been a rancher for 30 years, had seen his share of trouble. Rustlers, drifters, men running from things they couldn't outrun. But this was different. The boy wasn't just scared. He was marked. "Come inside," Thomas said. The boy didn't move. "You can't stay out here. They'll see the light." Thomas glanced at the house behind him. One lantern burning in the kitchen, barely enough to see by. He looked back at the boy, at the way his feet were planted in the dirt like he was ready to bolt the second something moved in the distance. "All right," Thomas said. "We'll keep it dark." He stood, opened the door wider, and waited. The boy hesitated, then crossed the threshold like he was stepping into a church, slow, reverent, afraid of what might happen if he made too much noise. Thomas followed him in, closed the door, and slid the bolt home. Inside, the boy stood in the center of the kitchen, arms wrapped around himself. Thomas moved to the stove, checked the embers, added a piece of wood. The fire caught, and a faint orange glow filled the room. "Sit," Thomas said, nodding toward the table. The boy sat. His eyes never stopped moving, door, window, shadows in the corners. Thomas poured water into a tin cup, set it in front of him. The boy stared at it like he didn't know what to do with it. "Drink." The boy drank. His hands shook so badly the water spilled down his chin, but he kept drinking until the cup was empty. Thomas pulled out a chair and sat across from him. He didn't ask questions yet. Questions could wait. Right now, the boy needed to remember he was still human. "What's your name?" Thomas asked quietly. The boy looked up. His eyes were gray, the kind of gray that comes from seeing too much too soon. "Eli," he said. "Eli." Thomas nodded. "I'm Thomas. This is my land. You're safe here." Eli's face twisted, something between a laugh and a sob. "Nobody's safe." Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying the boy. There were bruises along his jaw, faint but visible in the firelight. His feet were cut, the kind of cuts you get from running through underbrush without shoes. And those burns on his wrists, those weren't accidental. Who did this to you? Thomas asked. Eli's gaze dropped to the table. He didn't answer. Thomas waited. Silence had a way of pulling truth to the surface, and he'd learned long ago not to rush it. After a moment, Eli spoke. His voice was so quiet Thomas almost didn't hear it. The deacon. The name settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water. Thomas felt the ripples, felt the weight of it pressing against his ribs. He knew that name. Everyone in the valley knew that name. The deacon wasn't a preacher. Despite what people called him, he was something worse, a man who believed his own mythology, who'd gathered a following of drifters and outlaws and turned them into something that resembled a congregation. They moved through the territory like a plague, taking what they wanted, leaving nothing but silence behind. Thomas had heard stories. Farms burned, families gone, children disappearing in the night. He looked at Eli, at the rope burns, at the fear etched into every line of his face. You were with them, Thomas said. It wasn't a question. Eli nodded. How long? 6 months. Maybe more. I don't. He shook his head. I don't remember. Thomas's jaw tightened. They take you? They took all of us. Eli's voice broke. There were 12. Now there's just me. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind finally stirred, rattling the shutters. Thomas stood, moved to the window, and looked out at the road. Nothing yet. But if the deacon's men were coming, they'd come quiet. They always did. He turned back to Eli. Why'd you run? Eli's hands clenched into fists on the table. Because I heard them talking. They said. He stopped, swallowed hard. They said I was next. Thomas felt the weight of the rifle in his hands, felt the years pressing down on his shoulders. He was too old for this, too tired. But the boy was here, and the night was closing in, and there wasn't anyone else. How many? Thomas asked. 4, maybe 5. Armed? Eli nodded. Thomas crossed the room, pulled a second rifle from the cabinet, checked the chamber. He set it on the table, then opened a drawer and took out a box of shells. Eli watched him, eyes wide. You're not sending me back. No, Thomas said. I'm not. They'll kill you. Maybe. Thomas loaded the rifle, the sound of metal sliding against metal loud in the quiet. But they'll have to get through that door first. Eli stared at him, something flickering in his eyes, hope, maybe, or disbelief. Thomas wasn't sure which. The wind picked up outside, carrying with it the faint sound of hoofbeats in the distance. Thomas looked at the boy. Stay away from the windows, he said. Thomas moved through the house like a man preparing for a siege. He checked the doors, the windows, the back entrance that led to the root cellar. He pulled the curtains tight, snuffed out the lantern in the kitchen, and left only the embers in the stove glowing. In the dark, the house felt smaller, the walls closer. Eli sat at the table, watching him with those wide gray eyes. You've done this before, the boy said quietly. Thomas didn't answer. He pulled a chair to the front window, positioned it so he could see the road without being seen. The rifle rested across his lap, familiar weight, cold comfort. Have you? Eli pressed. Thomas glanced at him. Once. Did you win? I'm still here. Eli seemed to consider that. Then, softer. What about them? Thomas looked back out the window. The horizon was still empty, but the hoofbeats were louder now, closer, though still distant enough to be ghosts. They weren't. The boy went quiet. Minutes passed. The wind moved through the valley, carrying dust and the smell of sagebrush. Thomas's hands didn't shake. They hadn't shaken in years, not since the war, not since he'd learned that survival was a choice you made with your whole body, not just your mind. Why are you helping me? Eli asked suddenly. Thomas turned. The boy was leaning forward, elbows on the table, face half hidden in shadow. He looked younger in the dark, more fragile. Because you're here. Thomas said. That's not a reason. It's the only reason. Eli shook his head. You don't even know me. Don't need to. You don't know what I did. Thomas set the rifle down carefully, stood, and crossed to the table. He pulled out a chair and sat, facing the boy directly. Eli wouldn't meet his eyes. What did you do? Thomas asked. Eli's hands clenched in his lap. I helped them. Helped them how? They made me. His voice caught. They made me go into houses first, small enough to fit through windows. I'd unlock the doors, let them in. He looked up and his eyes were wet. I let them in. Thomas didn't flinch. You were a child. I knew what they were going to do. Did you have a choice? Eli's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His face crumpled, and he looked away, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes. Thomas waited. No, Eli whispered finally. No, I didn't. Then it's not on you. It feels like it is. I know. Thomas's voice was steady, low, but it's not. Eli lowered his hands. His face was blotchy, streaked with tears he hadn't let fall yet. Why would you believe me? Because I've seen men who lie. You're not one of them. The boy stared at him, something shifting behind his eyes, something that looked like the first crack in a wall that had been holding back a flood. They'll kill you for this, Eli said again. You know that, right? Probably. Then why? Because if I don't, I'm no different than they are. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than the silence that followed. Outside, the hoofbeats stopped. Thomas's head snapped toward the window. He rose, grabbed the rifle, and moved back to his post. Eli stayed frozen at the table, barely breathing. Thomas scanned the horizon. Nothing. No movement, no shapes, no shadows that didn't belong. But the sound had stopped, and that was worse than if it had kept coming. They're here, Eli whispered. Maybe. They're waiting. Thomas knew he was right. The deacon's men weren't fools. They'd circle first, check the perimeter, look for weaknesses. They'd know someone was inside. They'd know Thomas wasn't alone. Get down, Thomas said. Under the table. Eli obeyed without question, sliding off the chair and curling himself into the smallest shape he could manage. Thomas heard his breathing, fast and shallow, the sound of a rabbit in a snare. Thomas stayed at the window, eyes on the road, on the barn, on the line of trees to the north. The moon was high now, casting long shadows across the dirt. Anything that moved would stand out. And then he saw it, a figure, just at the edge of the tree line, tall, unmoving, watching the house. Thomas's finger moved to the trigger. The figure didn't advance. It just stood there, a silhouette against the pale bark of the cottonwoods, waiting, watching. Thomas didn't fire. Not yet. Another shape emerged to the left, shorter, broader, moving in a slow arc around the property. Then a third, to the right, keeping distance but closing the circle. 3 so far. Thomas counted in his head. Eli had said 4, maybe 5. Where were the others? The back door rattled. Thomas spun, rifle raised. Eli gasped under the table. The rattling stopped. Then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate strikes against the wood. A voice followed, smooth and low, like honey poured over gravel. Mr. Garrett. Thomas didn't answer. We know you're in there. We know you're not alone. Thomas's jaw tightened. He moved toward the back of the house, keeping his body between the door and the table where Eli hid. We don't want any trouble. The voice continued. We just want what's ours. Boys, not yours. Thomas called back. A pause. Then a low chuckle. That's not for you to decide. He's on my land. That makes it my decision. Another pause. Longer this time. Thomas could hear whispers now. Muffled conversation on the other side of the door. He imagined them standing there, calculating, weighing their options. You're making a mistake, the voice said. Wouldn't be the first time. Silence. Then the voice again. Colder now. We'll give you one chance. Send the boy out and we leave. You'll never see us again. Thomas looked down at the table. He could see Eli's eyes in the dark, wide and terrified, locked on him like he was the only thing keeping the world from ending. "No," Thomas said. The voice didn't respond. The rattling stopped. The whispers faded. And then, from somewhere outside, came the unmistakable sound of a match striking. Thomas's blood went cold. He ran to the front window just in time to see the first torch arc through the air, spinning end over end, trailing sparks like a comet. It hit the barn. Flames erupted, crawling up the dry wood, spreading fast. Thomas swore under his breath. Eli crawled out from under the table, saw the fire, and froze. "They're gonna burn us out," he whispered. Thomas gripped the rifle tighter, watching the barn collapse into itself, watching the smoke rise into the night sky like a signal. He looked at Eli. "Not yet," he said. The barn burned like a beacon, and the light painted everything in shades of orange and black. Thomas could see them now, all of them. 4 men, spread out in a loose semicircle around the house. They stood just beyond the firelight, faces obscured by shadow and the brims of their hats. One held a rifle, another held a torch. The third had his hands on his hips, watching the barn collapse with the patience of a man who had all night. The fourth stood apart from the others, taller, draped in a long coat that moved with the wind like a living thing. The deacon. Thomas had never seen him before, but he knew. There was something in the way he stood still, certain, untouched by doubt. He didn't need to shout or gesture. His presence alone commanded the space around him. The deacon raised one hand, and the men stopped moving. He stepped forward, into the light. His face was lean, sharp-featured, with eyes that caught the firelight and held it. He looked older than Thomas had imagined, 50, maybe more, but there was no softness in him, no sign of age slowing him down. He moved like a man who had walked through fire before and expected to do it again. "Mr. Garrett," he called out. His voice carried easily over the roar of the flames. "I admire your conviction, truly, but you're wasting both our time." Thomas stayed at the window, rifle raised, finger resting just outside the trigger guard. The deacon continued. "The boy belongs to us. We raised him, fed him, gave him purpose. And now you, a stranger, think you can take that away? He's not property," Thomas called back. The deacon smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Everything is property, Mr. Garrett. Everything and everyone. The sooner you understand that, the easier this becomes." Thomas said nothing. The deacon tilted his head, studying the house like a puzzle he was close to solving. "You're alone in there. 1 man, 1 rifle, maybe 2 if you're clever. We have 4. We have fire. We have time." He spread his hands, as if offering a gift. "This doesn't have to end with you dead. Doesn't have to end with you walking away either," Thomas said. The deacon's smile faded. For a long moment, the only sound was the fire, the crackling of wood and the groan of beams giving way. The barn roof collapsed inward, sending a column of sparks into the sky. "You're not a hero, Mr. Garrett," the deacon said quietly. "You're just an old man who doesn't know when to let go." Thomas felt Eli's presence behind him, small and trembling. "I know exactly what I am," Thomas said. The deacon's expression hardened. He turned, said something to the man with the torch, and stepped back into the shadows. The man with the torch moved forward. Thomas's pulse quickened. He sighted down the barrel, aimed for center mass. The man stopped 10 feet from the house, torch held high. "Last chance," the deacon called from the dark. "Send him out, or we burn you out." Thomas glanced back at Eli. The boy was pressed against the wall, arms wrapped around himself, eyes locked on the window. He looked like he wanted to say something, maybe to beg Thomas to let him go, maybe to apologize, maybe just to scream. Thomas turned back to the window. "No," he said. The deacon sighed. "So be it." The man with the torch drew his arm back. Thomas fired. The sound split the night like thunder. The bullet caught the man in the shoulder, spun him sideways, and sent the torch tumbling to the ground. He fell, clutching his arm, cursing. The other men scattered, diving for cover behind the water trough, the fence, the remains of the barn. Thomas worked the bolt, ejected the shell, and chambered another round. His hands moved on instinct, muscle memory older than thought. Return fire came fast, 3 shots in quick succession, splintering the window frame and punching holes through the wall above his head. Thomas dropped, rolled to the side, came up next to a different window. Eli was on the floor, hands over his ears, eyes squeezed shut. "Stay down," Thomas barked. He fired again, aiming for the shadow behind the water trough. Missed. Fired again. Missed. His hands were steady, but his heart was pounding now, the old familiar rhythm of combat flooding back into his veins. He wasn't scared, not exactly. Fear had burned out of him years ago, replaced by something colder, sharper. Another shot punched through the window, showering him with glass. He felt a sting along his forearm, looked down, saw blood welling up through a shallow cut. He ignored it. "Thomas!" Eli's voice, high and panicked. "Stay down." The firing stopped. Thomas waited, breathing hard, ears ringing. He scanned the yard, 2 men still behind cover, one down near the barn, the fourth, the deacon, nowhere to be seen. That was bad. Thomas moved to the back of the house, checked the door, the windows, nothing. He moved to the side, checked again, still nothing. Where the hell was he? A sound from above, soft, almost imperceptible. A scrape of boot against wood. The roof. Thomas's blood turned to ice. He looked up at the ceiling, at the trapdoor that led to the crawl space above. It was latched from the inside, but that wouldn't stop someone determined. He turned to Eli. "Move. Now." "Cellar." Eli scrambled to his feet, ran to the door Thomas pointed at. Thomas followed, keeping his eyes on the ceiling. He heard another sound, closer this time, directly above the kitchen. He grabbed Eli by the shoulder, pushed him toward the cellar door. "Get down there. Don't come up until I say." "What are you?" "Go." Eli hesitated, then obeyed. He pulled open the cellar door, disappeared down the narrow stairs into darkness. Thomas turned back just as the trapdoor exploded inward. The deacon dropped through, landing in a crouch, pistol already drawn. He fired before Thomas could react. The bullet grazed Thomas's ribs, a line of fire across his side. He staggered, brought the rifle up, but the deacon was faster. He lunged forward, knocked the barrel aside, and slammed the butt of his pistol into Thomas's jaw. Thomas went down hard, tasting blood, vision swimming. The deacon stood over him, pistol aimed at his chest. "Brave," the deacon said quietly, "but foolish." Thomas spat blood onto the floor, looked up at him. "You're not taking him." The deacon's expression didn't change. "I already have." He turned toward the cellar door. Thomas surged upward, drove his shoulder into the deacon's legs, brought him crashing down. They hit the floor together, grappling, punching, clawing for leverage. The pistol skittered away, lost in the dark. Thomas felt the deacon's hands close around his throat, felt the pressure building, the air cutting off. He drove his elbow into the man's ribs. Once, twice, felt something give. The deacon grunted, grip loosening. Thomas twisted, broke free, scrambled for the rifle. His fingers closed around the stock. He turned, brought it up. The deacon was already on his feet, knife in hand. They stared at each other across the dark kitchen, both breathing hard, both bleeding. From outside came the sound of the other men approaching, boots on wood, voices calling out. The deacon smiled, thin and cold. "It's over." Thomas's finger tightened on the trigger, and then, from the cellar, came Eli's voice. "Don't." The cellar door opened slowly. Eli climbed the stairs, one careful step at a time, his small frame silhouetted against the deeper darkness below. His hands were empty. His face was streaked with dirt and tears, but his eyes were steady, steadier than they'd been all night. "Don't," he said again, looking at Thomas. Thomas didn't lower the rifle. The deacon stood 5 feet away, knife still in hand, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth where Thomas had landed a punch. "Eli." Thomas said, voice tight. Get back down there. The boy shook his head. No, this isn't your fight anymore. Yes, it is. Eli's voice cracked, but he didn't retreat. He looked at the deacon, and something passed between them, something Thomas couldn't name. Recognition, history, pain. The deacon's expression softened, just slightly. Eli, come here. Eli didn't move. You don't belong with him. The deacon continued, his voice low and careful, like he was talking to a spooked horse. You know that. You've always known that. I don't belong with you either, Eli said. The deacon's jaw tightened. I saved you. You used me. I gave you purpose. You gave me nightmares. The words hung in the air, sharp and raw. Outside, the other men had stopped at the door, waiting for some signal. The barn was nearly gone now, reduced to embers and ash, the light fading. The deacon lowered the knife slightly. Everything I did to make you strong, to prepare you for a world that doesn't forgive weakness. You made me scared, Eli said quietly. That's all you did. Thomas watched the boy, saw the way he stood, small, fragile, but unmoving. There was something in him now that hadn't been there before, something that looked like the beginning of courage. The deacon took a step forward. Eli, stop. Eli's voice was firm. Don't come closer. The deacon stopped. For a moment, no one moved. Thomas kept the rifle trained on the deacon, but his eyes kept drifting to Eli, to the way the boy's hands trembled even as his voice held steady. I heard you, Eli said. That night, in the tent, you and the others. You were talking about what to do with me. The deacon said nothing. You said I was a liability. You said I knew too much. You said, Eli's voice broke, but he pushed through it. You said it would be easier if I just disappeared. The deacon's face remained unreadable. You misunderstood. No, I didn't. Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest. He looked at the deacon, saw the calculation behind his eyes, the way he was measuring distances, angles, possibilities. You were going to kill him. The deacon didn't deny it. He's a child. He's a witness. Thomas's grip tightened on the rifle. That's all he is to you? A witness? The deacon's expression hardened. He's a loose end, and I don't leave loose ends. Eli flinched, but he didn't look away. Thomas felt a surge of something hot and sharp in his chest, anger. Maybe, or something older than that. He'd seen men like the deacon before, men who thought the world was something to be controlled, bent, shaped to their will, men who saw other people as tools or obstacles, nothing more. He's not a loose end, Thomas said quietly. He's a person. The deacon laughed, a short, bitter sound. And what do you think that means? You think that makes him special? You think that gives him some kind of shield? He shook his head. The world doesn't care about people, Mr. Garrett. It never has. Maybe not, Thomas said. But I do. The deacon stared at him, and for the first time, something like doubt flickered across his face. Not fear, he was too sure of himself for that, but a recognition that the man in front of him wasn't going to break. You're going to die for him, the deacon said. You understand that? If that's what it takes, why? Thomas didn't answer right away. He looked at Eli, at the boy who'd shown up in his yard with rope burns on his wrists and terror in his eyes. A boy who'd help monsters because he didn't have a choice. A boy who'd run because he'd finally found the strength to, because someone has to. Thomas said. The deacon's expression shifted something between respect and contempt. You're a fool. Maybe. They stood there, the three of them, locked in a moment that felt like it could stretch into eternity. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat, steady and slow. He could hear Eli's breathing, shallow but controlled. He could hear the wind outside, carrying the smell of smoke and ash. And then Eli spoke. I'll go with you. Both men turned to stare at him. Eli, Thomas started. I'll go with you, Eli repeated, looking at the deacon. If you leave him alone, if you promise not to hurt him. The deacon's eyes narrowed. You think I'm going to negotiate with you? I think you want me more than you want him. That's not. I'll go, Eli said, louder now. But only if you swear. Right here. Right now. You leave him alone and I'll come back. Thomas felt his chest tighten. Eli, no. You don't have to. Yes, I do. Eli looked at him, and his eyes were wet but clear. You did this for me. Now I'm doing this for you. Eli, please. The boy's voice cracked. Please just let me do this. Thomas wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that it didn't work that way, that sacrifices like that didn't mean anything in the end. But he saw the look on Eli's face, saw the determination there, and he understood. The boy had spent 6 months as someone else's pawn. This was the first time he'd had a choice. Thomas looked at the deacon. If you take him, I'll hunt you, I'll find you, and I'll kill you. The deacon smiled. You can try. Eli stepped forward, closer to the deacon, farther from Thomas. Thomas's heart broke. And then, from outside came a new sound. Hoofbeats. Fast. Many. The deacon's head snapped toward the door. One of his men burst in, face pale. Riders. From the east. At least a dozen. The deacon swore under his breath. Thomas moved to the window, looked out. Through the fading smoke, he could see them, a line of silhouettes against the horizon, closing fast. Eli looked at Thomas. Who are they? Thomas felt something like relief wash over him. He recognized the lead rider, recognized the way he sat his horse. The marshal, Thomas said. The deacon's face went cold. He looked at his men, at the approaching riders, at Eli standing between him and the door. He made his decision. We're leaving. His men hesitated. Now. They ran. The deacon paused at the door, looked back at Eli one last time. This isn't over. Eli stared at him, unflinching. Yes, it is. The deacon disappeared into the night. Thomas lowered the rifle, legs suddenly weak. He sank into a chair, breathing hard, feeling the adrenaline drain out of him. Eli crossed the room, stood in front of him. Neither of them spoke. Outside, the riders arrived. The marshal dismounted first, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a badge pinned to his vest and a rifle slung across his back. He took one look at the burned barn, the shattered windows, the blood on the porch, and swore under his breath. Thomas, he called, striding toward the house. You alive in there? Thomas appeared in the doorway, rifle still in hand, face streaked with soot and blood. More or less. The marshal stopped, eyes sweeping over him. Jesus. What happened? The deacon. The marshal's expression darkened. He here? Was? He's gone now. Which way? Thomas pointed north, toward the tree line. 5 minutes ago. 4 men, maybe 5. They're on foot. The marshal turned, barked orders to the riders behind him. Half of them spurred their horses forward, disappearing into the darkness. The others dismounted, spreading out around the property, checking the barn, the yard, making sure nothing else was about to catch fire. The marshal turned back to Thomas. You hurt? Nothing that won't heal. The boy. Thomas stepped aside, and Eli appeared in the doorway. The marshal's eyes softened. Hell, he said quietly. He crouched down, bringing himself to Eli's level. You're the one the deacon took, from the Peterson farm. Eli nodded. How long you been with him? 6 months. The marshal's jaw tightened. He looked up at Thomas. How'd you end up with him? He showed up in my yard, said they were coming back for him, and you decided to make a stand. Didn't have much of a choice. The marshal stood, studied Thomas for a long moment. You could have sent him away. Could have told him it wasn't your problem. Could have. Thomas agreed. Didn't. The marshal smiled, just slightly. You always were a stubborn bastard. Thomas almost laughed. Takes one to know one. The marshal clapped him on the shoulder, careful to avoid the blood. We'll get your barn rebuilt, and I'll make sure the deacon knows this valley's off limits. If he's smart, he'll keep running, and if he's not, then we'll find him. The marshal's voice was hard. One way or another. Thomas nodded. He looked down at Eli, who stood beside him. quiet and watchful. The boy's face was pale, exhausted, but there was something different in his eyes now, something that looked like the beginning of peace. The marshal crouched down again, spoke directly to Eli. "You got family?" Eli shook his head. "Anywhere to go?" Another shake. The marshal looked up at Thomas. Thomas met his eyes. He didn't need to say anything. The marshal understood. "All right," the marshal said, straightening. "He stays with you for now. We'll sort the rest out later." Thomas felt something loosen in his chest. He nodded. The marshal turned, called to his men, and began organizing the search. The yard filled with voices, movement, the steady rhythm of people who knew what needed to be done. Thomas stepped back inside, Eli following. He set the rifle down, leaned it against the wall, and sank into a chair at the table. His side ached where the bullet had grazed him, and his jaw throbbed where the deacon had hit him. But he was alive. They were both alive. Eli stood across from him, hands clasped in front of him like he didn't know what to do with them. "Sit," Thomas said. Eli sat. They were quiet for a while, listening to the sounds outside, horses, voices, the creak of boots on wood. The fire was gone now, just embers glowing faintly in the dark. "Why did you do it?" Eli asked finally. Thomas looked at him. "Do what?" "All of it. You could have died. So could you. But I'm—" Eli stopped, swallowed. "I'm nobody." Thomas leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You're somebody to me." Eli's eyes went wide. He stared at Thomas like he didn't understand the words, like they were in a language he'd never heard before. "I don't even know you," Eli whispered. "Doesn't matter. It should matter. Maybe." Thomas's voice was steady. "But it doesn't." Eli looked down at his hands, at the rope burns that were still raw and red. "I don't know what to do now. You stay here. You rest. You heal. And then," Thomas considered that, "then we figure it out. Together." Eli looked up, and there were tears in his eyes, but he didn't try to hide them. "What if they come back? Then we'll deal with it. What if—" "Eli," Thomas's voice was gentle but firm, "they're not going to get you. Not while I'm breathing." Eli nodded, slow and uncertain, like he wanted to believe but didn't quite know how. Thomas stood, moved to the stove, and stoked the fire. He filled a pot with water, set it to boil, and pulled down 2 tin cups from the shelf. When the water was hot, he poured it, added a spoonful of coffee grounds, and set 1 cup in front of Eli. "Drink," he said. Eli wrapped his hands around the cup, feeling the warmth seep into his fingers. He took a sip, winced at the bitterness, but kept drinking. Thomas sat back down, holding his own cup. They drank in silence, and the silence was comfortable, something neither of them had felt in a long time. Outside, the marshal's men returned. Thomas heard the marshal's voice, low and satisfied. "They'd found tracks," he said, "heading north. They'd follow in the morning." Thomas didn't go out to hear the rest. He stayed inside, with Eli, and let the world take care of itself for a little while. When the sun finally rose, it painted the valley in shades of gold and amber. The barn was gone, reduced to a blackened skeleton, but the house still stood. The windows were shattered, the walls pocked with bullet holes, but it was still standing. Thomas stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, and looked out at the land. The marshal and his men were gone, off hunting the deacon and his crew. The valley was quiet again, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm. Eli joined him, standing at his side. "What happens now?" the boy asked. Thomas took a sip of coffee. "Thought about that. We rebuild the barn, fix the windows, get the horses back from wherever they ran off to. And me?" Thomas glanced down at him. "You help." Eli blinked. "Help?" "You wanted to know what to do. That's what you do. You help." A slow smile spread across Eli's face, tentative, fragile, but real. Thomas smiled back. They stood there on the porch, watching the sun climb higher, feeling the warmth on their faces. The valley stretched out before them, wide and open and full of possibility. It would take time, There would be hard days ahead, nights when the fear came back, moments when the past refused to stay buried. But they'd face it together, and that was enough. Years later, when Eli was grown and the deacon was nothing but a name spoken in whispers, people would ask him about that night. They'd ask him what it was like, how it felt, whether he was scared, and Eli would tell them the truth. He'd say that he was terrified, that he thought he was going to die, that he didn't understand why a stranger would risk everything for someone like him. But then he'd tell them about Thomas, about the man who stood in the doorway with a rifle and refused to let evil walk through, about the man who saw a scared boy and chose mercy over safety. And he'd tell him that Thomas taught him something that night, something the deacon never could. He taught him that the world might not care about people, but people could care about each other, and sometimes that was all the difference. The barn was rebuilt by autumn. Thomas and Eli worked on it together, side by side, hammer and nail, sweat and silence. When it was finished, they stood back and looked at it, and Eli said, "It's better than the old one." Thomas smiled. "Yeah, it is." They walked back to the house as the sun set, casting long shadows across the valley. The wind moved through the grass, carrying the smell of sage and earth and home, and for the first time in a long time, the night felt safe.